He shouldn't be driving. But what the officer found was much worse. Imagine you're a police officer on a quiet night, pulling over a car that's swerving erratically. You expect to find a drunk or distracted driver. But as you approach, you see something that makes your blood run cold. Behind the wheel is a 12-year-old boy, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. In the back seat, a baby crying in a loosely strapped car seat. But what truly shocks the officer isn't who is in the car. It's the boy's desperate plea. Please, don't take us back. What is this boy running from? Who is after them? What seemed like a simple runaway case quickly spirals into a high-stakes chase, a dark conspiracy, and a secret that the authorities will do anything to keep buried. Get ready for a heart-pounding story. But beware, the deeper we dig, the darker the truth becomes. Now, follow every detail of this chilling mystery and try to answer one question no one dares to ask. The night was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Officer Daniel Mercer sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine filling the silence as he scanned the darkened streets of Silverbrook. A light drizzle slicked the pavement, making the glow of the streetlights stretch endlessly into the distance. It was the kind of night where nothing happened. Until it did, his radio crackled to life. All units, be advised. Possible DUI. Silver sedan. Westbound on Riverton Road. Vehicle swerving in and out of lanes. Tag unconfirmed. Daniel straightened. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I'm near Riverton. I'll check it out. He flicked on his lights and turned onto the main road. Silverbrook wasn't big, but the winding roads outside the main square could be treacherous at night. It didn't take long before he spotted it. A silver sedan drifting between lanes like a boat in rough water. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. All right, buddy, let's see what's going on with you. He activated his siren. The sedan hesitated, its taillights flickering as if the driver was deciding whether to pull over. Then, slowly, it veered toward the shoulder and rolled to a stop. Daniel exhaled, leaving the engine idling as he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. His hand instinctively rested on his holster, just in case. Something about this didn't feel right. The window was cracked open just enough for Daniel to glimpse a shadowed figure inside. He shined his flashlight through the gap, his breath catching in his throat. The driver was a kid. Small, barely a teenager. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, his brown hair damp with sweat despite the cool night air. Daniel's training kicked in. Drunk parents? Stolen car? Runaway? A dozen possibilities flooded his mind, none of them good. He softened his tone. Hey there, son. You okay? The boy flinched. Daniel lowered the flashlight slightly. You mind telling me your name? The kid swallowed hard but didn't answer. Then, from the back seat, a muffled whimper. Daniel shifted his beam slightly and froze. A baby, a tiny infant, no older than a few months, strapped into a car seat that was barely secured. Her tiny feet kicked as she fussed, her face red from crying. Daniel's stomach dropped. This wasn't just strange. This was bad. He returned his focus to the boy, whose eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. Son, is the baby yours? The boy shook his head. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a hoarse whisper. Please, don't take us back. A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. Something about the way the kid said it, the absolute terror in his voice, set off every alarm in Daniel's mind. Back where? He asked carefully. The boy didn't answer. His breathing picked up and his grip on the wheel tightened. His eyes flicked again to the rearview mirror, his body tense like a trapped animal. Daniel could see it. The moment the kid made his decision, too late. The boy's foot slammed the gas. Hey, stop. The sedan lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. Daniel barely had time to jump back before the car shot off into the night, fishtailing wildly before gaining traction. For a split second, Daniel stood frozen, his brain catching up with what just happened. Then, instinct took over. He sprinted back to his cruiser, yanked the door open, and threw it into gear. Dispatch, suspect fled the stop, juvenile driver, infant in the back seat. Heading north on Riverton. Speeds climbing past 60. The radio crackled, but Daniel barely heard it. His eyes were locked on the sedan ahead as it swerved between lanes, narrowly missing a parked truck. The baby's cries echoed faintly from the open window, a sharp contrast to the roaring engine. This wasn't joyriding. This was panic. Daniel clenched his jaw. Time to end this before someone gets killed. He flicked on his speaker. "Son, you need to stop the car. Pull over now." No response. The sedan blew past a red light. If another car had been crossing, it would have ended in a fatal wreck. Daniel's fingers tightened around the wheel. The road ahead curved sharply left, leading toward an old construction site near Mill Creek. Dead end. Daniel's gut twisted. If the kid didn't slow down, he'd crash. The sedan's wheels skidded as the boy tried to correct the turn. But the pavement was still wet from the drizzle. The tires lost traction. Daniel's stomach plummeted as the car spun out, veering off the road completely. It slammed into a ditch. Metal crunched. Then, silence. Daniel barely remembered putting his car in park before he was running toward the wreck. The driver's door was ajar. Smoke curled from the crumpled hood. Daniel's breath was heavy as he reached inside, his pulse hammering in his ears. The boy was slumped against the seatbelt, his head tilted at an odd angle. A gash on his forehead leaked blood down his temple, but he was alive. "Kid. Hey, stay with me." Daniel checked for injuries, careful not to move him too much. The boy's eyes fluttered open. His voice was barely a whisper. "He's coming for us." Daniel's gut twisted. "Who, son? Who's coming?" The boy's gaze locked onto his. For the first time that night, he didn't look afraid. He looked certain. Then his head lulled forward as he lost consciousness. Daniel's throat tightened. He turned to the back seat. The baby, Emma, he guessed, was still crying, but otherwise unharmed. Daniel let out a slow breath. He tried to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. He had no idea who this boy was, but something told him this was only the beginning. The fluorescent lights of Silverbrook General flickered overhead as Daniel Mercer pushed through the double doors of the emergency wing. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the quiet hum of machines filling the space. At the end of the hall, Jake Carter lay unconscious on a hospital bed, an .4 in his arm, his forehead wrapped in gauze. In the adjacent pediatric unit, his infant sister Emma was being monitored, though she was unharmed. Detective Evelyn Ross stood by the window, arms crossed. She turned as Daniel approached. "What do we know?" he asked. Evelyn sighed. "Jake has a mild concussion, dehydration, and a few bruised ribs, but nothing life-threatening. The baby's fine, just shaken up." Daniel glanced through the glass panel at the boy, then back at Evelyn. "Did he say anything?" She shook her head. "Not a word. But judging by how fast he ran, I'd say he's more scared of where he came from than what happened tonight." Daniel exhaled. "Where's their mother?" Evelyn held up a file. "That's the question. Rachel Carter, last known address matches the registration of the sedan. No reports of domestic abuse. No criminal record. But she vanished 2 nights ago." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Vanished? How?" Evelyn opened the file. "She left work early that evening. No security footage of her returning home. Phone last pinged near the outskirts of town. Then nothing. Like she disappeared into thin air." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "So either she ran, or someone made sure she couldn't come back." Evelyn nodded grimly. "And I have a feeling we won't like the answer." Rachel Carter's house sat at the edge of Silverbrook, surrounded by tall pines and eerie silence. Daniel pulled his cruiser up to the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness. The front door was unlocked. Evelyn exchanged a wary glance with him before pushing it open. The air inside was stale, as if no one had been home in days. The soft glow of a kitchen light flickered weakly. Daniel scanned the room. "Doesn't look like a struggle." Evelyn moved toward the dining table, her sharp eyes taking in the details. A half-eaten plate of pasta sat abandoned on the counter, a fork resting beside it. She was interrupted, Evelyn muttered. "Didn't even have time to finish dinner." Daniel's gaze swept the floor. That's when he saw it. A faint streak of blood near the base of the refrigerator. Evelyn. She knelt beside him, studying the mark. Not enough to suggest a fatal wound. Daniel's mind was racing. So she was alive when she left. Evelyn looked around the house again, her frown deepening. Then why does it look like she didn't plan on leaving at all? Back at the precinct, the grainy black and white traffic camera footage played on the screen. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. Rachel Carter's silver sedan sped through the intersection, veering slightly as it rounded a curve. Behind the wheel, Rachel looked pale, frantic, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. But it was the way she kept glancing over her shoulder that sent a chill through Daniel. She was terrified, Evelyn said quietly. Daniel rubbed his jaw. Who the hell was she running from? A moment later, the car disappeared out of frame. For a few seconds, the road was empty. Then, another vehicle appeared. A dark SUV. It slowed when it reached the intersection, then accelerated in the same direction Rachel had gone. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's not a coincidence. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. No, it's not. She ran the plates. The result popped up. Fake registration, she muttered. Registered to a non-existent company. Daniel's voice was grim. Someone wanted her gone. Evelyn clicked on the footage again. Then why didn't they take the kids too? The thought made Daniel's blood run cold. Maybe they tried. Daniel and Evelyn sat in silence, staring at the screen. The SUV had been following Rachel, but no sign of her after that. Evelyn pulled up police records. No reports of abandoned vehicles matching her sedan. No calls from Rachel Carter before she disappeared. Whoever was after her, she either didn't have time to call for help, or she knew no one would answer. Daniel crossed his arms. Jake had to know something. That's why he ran. Evelyn tapped her fingers on the desk. What are the odds this is just a domestic dispute? Daniel shook his head. Rachel ran because she was scared. Jake fled because someone was coming for them. Evelyn's voice was low. And whatever happened to her isn't over. The baby monitor left behind in the car replayed in Daniel's mind. You're coming home, little girl. His stomach turned. We need to talk to Jake. Jake was awake when they returned to the hospital. He sat stiffly in the bed, his fingers fidgeting with the blanket. When he saw Daniel enter, he visibly tensed. Daniel pulled up a chair, keeping his voice even. You're safe now, kid. No one's going to hurt you. Jake's eyes darted between Daniel and Evelyn. He said nothing. Evelyn placed a small folder on the table and pulled out a photo. It was an old picture of Lucas Foster, Rachel's ex, the man presumed dead in a house fire years ago. Jake's reaction was instantaneous. His face went pale, his breathing hitched, and his fingers tightened into fists. Daniel leaned forward. Jake, who is this? Jake swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. That's the man who was in our house last night. A cold weight settled in Daniel's gut. He exchanged a look with Evelyn. She had the same expression, one of disbelief and growing dread. Lucas Foster was dead, wasn't he? The tension inside Silverbrook Police Department was thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel stood near his desk, arms crossed tightly over his chest as Agent Marshall Briggs stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over the gathered officers like a drill sergeant sizing up recruits. Briggs was a seasoned federal agent, with the crisp suit and cold demeanor to match. And the second he opened his mouth, Daniel knew exactly why he was here. As of now, this case is under federal jurisdiction, Briggs announced, holding up an official-looking document. All files, evidence, and investigative authority will be transferred to the Bureau. Daniel exchanged a glance with Evelyn, whose expression was unreadable, but he could see the tension in her clenched jaw. You're shutting us down? Daniel asked. Briggs didn't even blink. No, I'm ensuring it's handled properly. Bullshit. A few officers shifted awkwardly as Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and steady. 2 kids nearly got killed last night. Their mother is missing. We have reason to believe they were running from someone dangerous, and you're telling me to back off. Briggs sighed, as if dealing with a child. This is bigger than your department, Officer Mercer. You need to let the professionals take over. Daniel didn't back down. If this is so important, why is the FBI just now stepping in? Where were you when Rachel Carter disappeared? Where were you when her kids were running for their lives? Briggs barely reacted. Stand down, Mercer. That's an order. Evelyn grabbed Daniel's arm before he could say something he'd regret. Let it go. But Daniel wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. Because everything about this screamed cover-up, and he wasn't about to walk away. The rain had started falling lightly by the time Daniel and Evelyn arrived at Bright Harbor Secure Welfare Center. It wasn't much, just a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of town, with outdated security cameras and a single guard at the entrance. Not enough. Not for what they were dealing with. This is supposed to be secure? Daniel muttered, scanning the poorly lit parking lot. A toddler could break into this place. Briggs wanted them here, Evelyn said, arms folded. That's reason enough to be suspicious. Inside, they found Jake sitting on the edge of a cot, stiff as a board, while Emma slept in a crib against the far wall. The second he saw Daniel, he stood. "Get me out of here." Daniel knelt beside him. "I know you don't trust me, but I swear, we won't let anything happen to you." Jake's face twisted in frustration. "You don't get it. He's coming, and locks won't stop him." Before Daniel could respond, the lights flickered. Then, everything went black. The moment the power went out, Daniel's instinct screamed trap. "Stay here," he ordered Jake, but the boy grabbed his wrist. "No," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "They're already inside." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Who?" Jake swallowed hard. "Them." A metallic clang echoed down the hall, the sound of a security door being bypassed. Evelyn drew her gun, motioning for Daniel to move. They stepped into the hallway, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Daniel barely had time to react before a shadow moved in his periphery. A masked man slipped through the doorway of the pediatric ward. Daniel sprinted forward. "Stop!" Too late. By the time he reached the room, Jake and Emma were gone. The facility was in chaos. Officers scrambled through the halls, but Daniel already knew the truth. The intruders were long gone. The security system had been wiped. No alarms. No surveillance. Nothing. Except one thing. Evelyn knelt beside the crib where Emma had been sleeping. A baby monitor had been left behind. It crackled to life. A voice whispered through the static. "You're coming home, little girl." Daniel clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles ached. Whoever did this wasn't afraid. They were taunting him. Minutes later, one of the tech officers rushed over with a recovered file. A single grainy clip from the security feed. The footage was black and white, but Daniel recognized the figure carrying Emma immediately. His breath left him in a rush. Lucas Foster, the man who was supposed to be dead. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the frozen image of Lucas Foster's smirking face on the monitor. He could still hear Jake's words echoing in his head. "That's the man who was in our house last night." Daniel ran a hand down his face. "This isn't possible." "It is," Evelyn said. "We just don't know how." Daniel's jaw tightened. Why take them? If Foster wanted revenge, why not take Rachel too? Why go after the kids? Evelyn tapped her fingers on the desk. Because they were the loose ends. Whatever Rachel knew, whatever she was running from, Foster couldn't risk leaving them behind. Daniel's stomach twisted. The FBI's covering something up. Evelyn didn't argue. And we just got kicked off the case. Daniel leaned back, exhaling sharply. "So we go rogue." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You really want to go to war with the feds?" Daniel's eyes stayed locked on the screen. "If it means getting those kids back?" He met her gaze, unwavering. "Then yeah, we're going to war." Daniel Mercer leaned against the hood of his cruiser, the cold night air biting against his skin. His jaw was tight, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Across from him, Evelyn Ross scrolled through her phone, lips pressed into a thin line. "Luis Mercado," she said, turning the screen toward him. "Ex-trafficker. Used to run girls across state lines. Now he's a washed-up informant who's lucky to be alive." Daniel studied the grainy photo on the screen. The man in the image looked worn out, deep wrinkles carved into his face, his left leg stiff from an old injury. "You think he knows where Foster is?" Evelyn smirked. "Mercado doesn't breathe unless someone pays him to. If Foster's back in the game, this guy will have heard about it." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Let's find him." It didn't take long. A few well-placed calls led them to a rundown apartment complex on the east side of Silverbrook. The building should have been condemned years ago. Peeling paint, broken windows, the faint stench of mold clinging to the air. Evelyn knocked. "Luis Mercado, open up. We need to talk." Silence. Daniel frowned. "He's in there." They heard a shuffle inside. Then the door creaked open just an inch. A bloodshot eye peered through. "Jesus, man. You cops don't know how to knock." Daniel pushed the door open before Mercado could protest. "We're not here for small talk. Where's Lucas Foster?" Mercado's smirk faltered. His bloodshot gaze darted to Evelyn, then back to Daniel. "You're lying. Foster's dead." Evelyn tossed a USB drive onto the table. Footage from a child welfare facility he just hit. "You want to rethink your answer?" Mercado rubbed a hand down his face. He looked genuinely rattled. "Shit." Daniel leaned in. "Tell us everything." Mercado ran a shaky hand through his thinning hair. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Enlighten us." Mercado exhaled heavily, then reached into a drawer, pulling out a USB drive. "One of my old contacts slipped me this before he went missing. It's security footage from one of Foster's safe houses." Daniel took the drive, exchanging a look with Evelyn before plugging it into his laptop. The footage was grainy, black and white. A warehouse, rows of cages, and in the middle of them, Rachel Carter. Daniel's stomach twisted. She looked barely conscious, slumped against metal bars, her wrists zip-tied. And she wasn't alone. Other women, other captives. Evelyn cursed under her breath. "Jesus Christ." Mercado shook his head. "Foster never died. The fire? That was staged. Big money made it happen. And now he's back, and bigger than ever." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Where is this warehouse?" Mercado hesitated. "That's the thing. It's not out of state. Not hidden in some far-off place." He turned the screen toward them. "It's right here in Silverbrook." Daniel and Evelyn sat inside the precinct, staring at the blueprints of the warehouse Mercado had given them. Evelyn tapped the map. "This place is big. It's not just a storage facility. It's a distribution hub." Daniel's stomach turned. "Which means they're not just keeping people there. They're moving them." Evelyn nodded grimly. "We need to hit this place before it's too late." Daniel pulled out his phone. "I'll call SWAT." Mercado shifted uncomfortably. "You really think Foster's gonna sit there and wait for you? He's always 3 steps ahead." Daniel glanced at him. "Then we better start running." The SWAT team moved in at 2:17 a.m. A breech charge blue opened the side entrance, sending a shockwave through the night. The first team moved in, rifles raised. Gunfire erupted. Daniel ducked behind a crate as bullets tore through the air. Beside him, Evelyn fired a controlled burst, taking down one of the traffickers guarding the cages. They pushed forward, deeper into the warehouse. The stench of gasoline and sweat filled the space. Metal clanged as women and children screamed for help. Daniel spotted Rachel Carter in the far cage. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open as he reached her. "Rachel." Her lips moved, but her voice was too weak. He pulled out a knife, cutting through her restraints. "You're safe." Rachel grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were weak, but her grip was desperate. Her voice was barely a whisper. "No, it's not over." Daniel's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Rachel coughed. "It was never about me." A metallic clang rang out. Daniel turned just in time to see Lucas Foster standing on the catwalk above, holding Emma in his arms. And Foster was smiling. For a moment, everything went still. Foster's voice carried through the warehouse. "Hell of a show, Mercer." Daniel's fingers tightened around his gun. "Put her down." Foster chuckled. "You never understood, did you?" He adjusted his grip on Emma, holding her like she was his own child. "This was never about Rachel. It was about them." Daniel's blood ran cold. "You think you're walking out of here?" Foster tilted his head. "I don't think, Officer Mercer." "I know." Then he dropped a smoke grenade. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Daniel lunged forward, but the thick, choking fog engulfed him. He heard shouting, the clash of boots against concrete, but Foster was already moving. By the time the smoke cleared, he was gone. Rachel grabbed Daniel's arm. "He's taking her overseas." Daniel's breath was ragged. "Where?" Rachel's voice was weak. "Dock 6. Evelyn's eyes went wide. The ship. Daniel's gut twisted. They had minutes. Let's move. The rain-soaked streets of Silverbrook blurred as Daniel drove, his hands clenched around the wheel. Evelyn sat beside him, eyes glued to her phone as she replayed Rachel Carter's weak, gasping words. Doc 6, not Doc 17. The realization had sent a jolt of adrenaline through Daniel. The FBI was chasing a false lead. We need to get to Doc 6 now. Evelyn's voice was firm. If we're right, Foster isn't running. He's waiting. Daniel tightened his grip. Briggs won't send backup. We're alone. Evelyn exhaled sharply. Then we finish this our way. They had minutes to act. If they failed, Emma would disappear forever. The MV Blackwood loomed in the dark, rust-streaked and silent. Dock 6 was deserted, too deserted. No workers, no security, no movement. Daniel and Evelyn moved swiftly up the gangplank, their guns drawn. A soft cry echoed from below deck. Daniel's stomach turned. Emma, Evelyn whispered, he's down there. Daniel nodded. We end this. They pushed through the narrow, dimly lit corridors, the air thick with the scent of oil and salt. Their boots barely made a sound against the metal flooring. Then, a voice from the darkness. You really don't give up, do you? Daniel spun. At the far end of the passageway, Lucas Foster stood, a knife in one hand and Emma in the other. Daniel's pulse hammered. Foster smirked, adjusting Emma in his arms like she was his own child. You made it, Foster said mockingly. Guess you're not as useless as I thought. Daniel gritted his teeth. Put her down. Foster tilted his head. Or what? You'll shoot? And risk hitting the baby? Evelyn took a slow step forward, gun raised. You're out of moves, Foster. Foster's smile widened. Am I? Then, in one swift motion, he flipped the knife in his grip. Daniel lunged. Pain exploded in his side as the blade plunged deep into his abdomen. He barely registered it. With one final burst of strength, Daniel drove his shoulder into Foster, slamming him against the metal wall. Emma slipped from Foster's grasp. Evelyn caught her. Run! Daniel gasped. Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and ran. Foster, bleeding, snarled. Big mistake. He lunged again, but Daniel was faster. He twisted Foster's knife hand, snapping the bone with a sickening crack. Foster screamed, staggering back. Daniel didn't stop. He grabbed Foster by the collar and slammed him onto the deck. Once, twice. Foster's struggles weakened. Daniel stood over him, panting, blood seeping through his shirt. Foster coughed, his smirk returning despite the pain. Still too late. Daniel froze. What did you do? Foster's voice was weak, but victorious. There's another buyer. Daniel's blood ran cold. There was more than one shipment, more than one child, and they had no idea where. Foster laughed, choking on blood. You'll never stop at all. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Foster's gun, pressed it to his forehead. Watch me. A single gunshot echoed across the ship. Daniel stumbled onto the deck, bleeding heavily. Evelyn stood at the railing, Emma wrapped securely in her arms. Sirens filled the night air. The FBI had finally arrived. Evelyn's face went pale as she saw Daniel's wound. You're not going to make it. Daniel gritted his teeth. We're out of time. The gangplank was too far. The only way off the ship was the water below. He grabbed Emma from Evelyn's arms. You can't. Daniel took one last breath and jumped. The ocean swallowed them whole. Daniel's vision blurred as strong hands dragged him onto the dock. He barely registered the frantic voices, the flashing lights, the chaos around him. He only cared about one thing. Emma. She was crying, but safe. Evelyn knelt beside him, pressing a hand against his bleeding side. You stubborn bastard. Daniel coughed, a weak grin on his lips. Did we win? Evelyn sighed, shaking her head. For now. Rachel Carter was already sprinting toward them, tears streaking down her face. She collapsed onto her knees, pulling Emma into her arms. Daniel let out a shaky breath. They had done it. Emma was going home. Jake was getting his sister back, and Lucas Foster was finally gone. But as Daniel lay there, the weight of the night pressing down on him, he realized This wasn't over. There were more ships, more buyers, and someone had been pulling the strings from the beginning. As the paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher, he locked eyes with Agent Briggs, standing at the edge of the chaos. The man's expression was unreadable, but Daniel knew. He knew. Briggs had known about this the whole damn time. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Daniel Mercer blinked against the dull ache in his side. The stitches pulled every time he breathed too deeply, a painful reminder of just how close he had come to not making it out alive. Evelyn Ross sat in the chair beside his bed, arms crossed. She looked exhausted but unshaken, her dark eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble. "You're supposed to be resting," she muttered. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Feels like a waste of time." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You got stabbed, jumped off a ship with a baby, and nearly bled out in the process. I think you can afford a break." Daniel smirked. "We both know this isn't over." She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled a folder from her bag and slid it onto the table. "Then you'll want to see this." Daniel hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were photos, grainy surveillance images, documents with classified redactions, financial transfers to offshore accounts. At the center of it all, one name stood out: Marshall Briggs. Daniel felt his stomach turn. "You were right," Evelyn said. "Foster wasn't working alone. He was protected." Daniel clenched his jaw. Briggs knew everything. Evelyn nodded grimly. "And now, he's tying up loose ends." The Silverbrook Police Department was in chaos. Phones rang. Officers rushed between desks, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The trafficking ring had fallen apart overnight, but new cracks had appeared in the case. Cracks that led straight to people who were supposed to be upholding the law. Daniel walked through the precinct slowly, his body still sore from his injuries. Evelyn followed close behind, flipping through reports. "Half of the men Foster worked with were arrested," she said. "But the real players? The ones who funded him? They're still out there." Daniel wasn't surprised. Corruption didn't just die. It adapted. "And Briggs?" he asked. Evelyn sighed. "Still untouchable." Daniel clenched his fists. Not for long. They both knew this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. Briggs was waiting for him. Daniel had expected it. The FBI agent sat behind a desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward the chair opposite him, but Daniel didn't sit. "You're making a mess, Mercer," Briggs said, his voice cool. Daniel's jaw tightened. "And you're covering one up?" Briggs exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? This was never about Foster. He was a tool, a distraction." Daniel's stomach turned. "So who were you really protecting?" Briggs leaned back in his chair, studying him. Then, he slid a folder across the desk. Daniel opened it. Inside was a contract, a job offer. "Join us," Briggs said. "Work for the people who actually pull the strings. You've already proven you won't stop until you get answers. Why waste that potential?" Daniel stared at him. Then, he laughed. A cold, bitter laugh. Briggs tilted his head. "What's funny?" Daniel stood. "You really think I'd sign up for the same people who let kids like Jake and Emma get taken?" Briggs smirked. "You want to make a difference? This is the only way." Daniel leaned forward. "No, the only way is making sure you don't get away with this." Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. "A shame. I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." Daniel smiled. "That's the thing, Briggs. You made a mistake." Briggs frowned. "And what's that?" Daniel's voice was calm, steady, deadly. "You let me live." He turned and walked out, leaving the folder behind. This wasn't over. Not even close. The airport terminal was nearly empty. Rachel Carter stood near the boarding gate, her hand tightly gripping Jake's. Emma rested against her chest, fast asleep. Daniel watched from a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Jake turned, hesitant. "So, this is it?" Daniel nodded. "You'll be safe where you're going. No one will find you." Jake swallowed. "And what about you?" Daniel smirked. "I'll be around." Rachel stepped forward. "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shook his head. "Just give them a life where they don't have to be afraid." Rachel's eyes softened. Jake hesitated, Then, without warning, hugged Daniel tightly. Daniel tensed for a moment before returning the hug. "Thank you for believing me," Jake whispered. Daniel's chest tightened. "Always." Rachel squeezed his hand one last time before turning toward the gate. A moment later, they were gone. Daniel watched the plane disappear into the sky, wondering if he'd ever see them again. Then, he turned and walked away. There was still work to do. The streets of Silverbrook were quiet. Daniel sat in his squad car, staring at the badge in his hands. For years, he had told himself this was enough. That being a cop, following the rules, playing the game, that it meant something. But now, he knew better. He had seen the rot beneath the surface, and he had no intention of letting it stay buried. He slipped the badge into the glove box. Then, he turned on the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as he pulled onto the road. There were more ships out there, more buyers, more monsters in suits pretending to be men. And Daniel Mercer was done playing defense. It was time to go hunting. As he drove into the night, one question echoed in his mind. How do you stop a ghost? You become one. As we peel back the layers of this chilling case, one question lingers. How deep does the corruption go? What started as a routine traffic stop unraveled into a dark web of secrets, human trafficking, and a powerful conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of authority. But if there's one thing this case proves, it's that the shadows never truly disappear. They only shift. So, what happens next? If one operation was exposed, how many more are still out there, hidden in plain sight? Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think happened to Rachel Carter before she disappeared? And do you believe there are real-life cases that mirror this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you want to see more deep-dive investigations into cases like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. See you in the next video.